Imagine this. It's the dead of winter, 1863. Thousands of soldiers are freezing, starving, and fighting in the mud-soaked fields of Pennsylvania. Amid the chaos, one man quietly changes the course of history, but almost no one remembers his name today. His decisions were daring, unconventional, and in some cases considered reckless. Yet those choices saved countless lives and reshaped the American Civil War. This man was Brigadier General George Armstrong Custer. Yes, the same Custer most people only know for his tragic defeat at Littleborn. But long before that infamous last stand, Custer was a rising star in the Union Army, known for audacious cavalry tactics and an almost supernatural sense of timing. In July 1863, after the Union victory at Gettysburg, most historians focus on the massive clashes of infantry. But here's the astonishing part. Custer and his cavalry were conducting a series of lightning raids that cut off Confederate supply lines in ways no one expected. Riding day and night, dodging enemy patrols, he captured entire wagon trains laden with food and ammunition, resources that could have allowed General Lee to regroup. One particularly bold maneuver involved Custer leading just 300 men against a Confederate encampment of over 1,500 soldiers. Conventional wisdom said it was impossible. Yet, using the element of surprise and a clever feint, Custer's forces overwhelmed the camp in less than 2 hours. They captured artillery pieces, horses, and critical intelligence without losing a single soldier. One story from this period is almost unbelievable. On a foggy morning in November, Custer received word that a Confederate supply depot near the Rappahannock River contained critical munitions. Rather than waiting for reinforcements, he rode at dawn with just 150 men. The fog was so thick that even experienced scouts lost their bearings, yet Custer pressed forward. By midday, he had captured the entire depot, and the Confederates, believing they were under attack by a full brigade, surrendered without firing a shot. This daring act earned him accolades, but it also drew the attention of President Abraham Lincoln. Unlike many generals whose names faded into obscurity, Custer was summoned to Washington for a private audience. Lincoln, a man deeply concerned about the war's progress, reportedly told Custer, "Your boldness borders on madness, but it works. Keep doing what others fear." Yet behind the praise, there were warning signs. Custer's reliance on intuition rather than conventional strategy unsettled some senior officers. They worried that a single miscalculation could lead to catastrophe. And in truth, Custer himself knew the stakes. He carried the burden of knowing that one false move could wipe out his men entirely. What makes this chapter so remarkable and often overlooked is how Custer's campaigns influenced the larger course of the Civil War. By disrupting supply lines, forcing Confederate detachments to divert attention, and creating the illusion of larger Union forces, he indirectly allowed key Union generals to execute more strategic victories in other theaters. In short, a handful of cavalrymen, under a daring young general, quietly shifted the balance of power. And yet, even in these moments of glory, there were glimpses of the tragic pattern that would later define his legacy. His insatiable thirst for action, combined with a refusal to heed caution, planted the seeds of the fateful decisions that would later culminate at Littlebourne. But for now, in the winter of 1863-64, Custer was at the height of his power, an almost mythic figure, racing through forests and rivers, altering history with each daring raid. As winter turned to spring in 1864, Custer's operations took on an almost legendary quality. He became known among his men not just as a commander, but as a force of nature. Soldiers recalled that he would ride ahead of his troops into unknown terrain, scout enemy positions alone, and return with precise information that turned the tide of skirmishes. His methods were unconventional: feints, night raids, and rapid river crossings that confounded Confederate leaders. One astonishing episode occurred near Culpeper, Virginia, where intelligence suggested a Confederate cavalry unit was preparing an ambush. Custer, leading only 200 men, devised a risky plan. He split his force into 3 smaller units, each taking a separate route through the dense forests. The Confederates, expecting a single frontal attack, were thrown into chaos. By nightfall, Custer had captured several hundred prisoners and seized artillery pieces, all while sustaining minimal casualties. This single operation disrupted enemy communications across the entire region. But perhaps the most fascinating aspect of Custer's campaigns during this period wasn't just the military victories. It was how he inspired his men. Letters from soldiers describe a commander who seemed fearless yet relatable, who shared rations, joked during long marches, and constantly motivated his men with stories of the home front. Historians argue that his charisma played as much a role in Union success as his tactical brilliance. Yet, shadows lurked behind these triumphs. Custer's reliance on intuition and risk-taking continued to draw criticism from more conservative generals. Some argued that his tactics were unsustainable, warning that one misstep could lead to disaster. Custer himself was aware of the danger, but he was also addicted to the adrenaline of the chase, the thrill of outsmarting an enemy who believed they were superior in numbers. A particularly daring moment came in March 1864, when Custer's cavalry intercepted a Confederate messenger carrying plans for an offensive against Union positions in the Shenandoah Valley. Realizing the value of the intelligence, Custer personally led a night raid to capture the courier. The operation required crossing icy rivers and navigating through enemy patrols. Miraculously, Custer succeeded without losing a single man. The information he recovered allowed Union forces to prepare and ultimately repel a major Confederate attack. Another instance where a single bold decision changed the course of history. Custer's winter campaigns after Gettysburg, often overlooked in mainstream history, demonstrate a rare combination: audacity, intuition, and the ability to inspire others. They were small in scale compared to famous battles like Gettysburg, yet their impact on the broader war was profound. For a brief, shining period, Custer wasn't just a rising star, he was a living legend, reshaping the battlefield in ways that few even realized at the time. By mid-1864, Custer's fame had reached the ears of the highest-ranking Union generals. Yet with recognition came pressure. His enemies, both on the battlefield and within his own command, were growing more vocal, questioning whether his high-risk tactics could last against increasingly prepared Confederate forces. Custer, however, remained undeterred. He believed that momentum was everything in war. He once remarked to a fellow officer, "The enemy hesitates only as long as we move faster than they can think." This philosophy would soon be put to the ultimate test. In June 1864, intelligence reported that a Confederate cavalry brigade was massing near Harrisonburg, Virginia, poised to strike a vital Union supply line. Custer, with roughly 400 men, faced nearly 1,200 Confederate soldiers fortified and ready. Conventional wisdom dictated caution, but caution was never Custer's style. In a move that stunned both his allies and enemies, he orchestrated a night assault through dense forest and rugged terrain, using the cover of darkness to conceal his approach. His cavalry split into smaller units, creating multiple points of attack. By the early hours of dawn, Custer had routed the Confederate forces, captured artillery and horses, and disrupted their plans for weeks. The operation not only saved Union supplies, but also earned him the admiration of his peers. Historians now recognize this campaign as a turning point in the Shenandoah Valley. Custer's raids forced Confederate commanders to overextend their resources, leaving them vulnerable in subsequent engagements. It was a masterclass in the use of mobility and surprise, a principle that military academies study even today. Yet amid these victories, signs of recklessness emerged. Some of his subordinates reported near catastrophic moments where Custer's boldness almost cost lives. But remarkably, through a combination of instinct, intelligence, and sheer daring, he consistently emerged unscathed. It was as if luck itself favored him, or, as many of his soldiers believed, he possessed a sixth sense for battle. By the fall of 1864, Custer was no longer just a young prodigy. He had become a symbol of audacity, a man whose name struck both fear and admiration into friend and foe alike. Yet the tension between genius and recklessness was growing. Every brilliant raid increased the stakes for the next. One wrong decision could undo everything he had achieved. And in this precarious balance of brilliance and risk, the story of Custer's winter and spring campaigns leaves an enduring question. How much of history is shaped by calculated courage and how much by sheer instinct? As 1864 progressed, Custer's daring campaigns became legendary, yet the stakes grew ever higher. Confederate forces, now wary of his unpredictable raids, began deploying traps and decoys designed specifically to counter his bold tactics. Every move Custer made was now a test not just of skill, but of survival. One of the most astonishing episodes occurred near Winchester, Virginia.
Custer received intelligence that a Confederate detachment was moving to reinforce their defensive positions along a critical supply route. Rather than waiting for orders, he assembled a small force, less than 300 men, and executed a bold flanking maneuver under the cover of a dense morning fog. What happened next seemed almost scripted for legend. The Confederate forces, believing they faced a much larger enemy, panicked. Custer captured over 500 prisoners, several cannons, and dozens of supply wagons. Soldiers under his command often recalled that he seemed to anticipate enemy moves before they were made, almost as if he could see through the fog of war. His unorthodox methods challenged traditional military thinking, forcing even skeptical generals to acknowledge his genius. Yet, behind the victories lay a growing tension. The more brilliant and audacious Custer became, the more enemies, both on and off the battlefield, he attracted. Custer's personal life, too, reflected this intensity. Letters he wrote to his wife revealed a man consumed by the war, constantly strategizing, obsessing over terrain maps, and studying enemy patterns. Yet he also displayed remarkable humanity, checking on wounded soldiers, sharing rations, and inspiring loyalty through personal bravery. Many historians argue that this duality, fearless in battle, compassionate to his men, was a key factor in his repeated successes. However, the shadow of recklessness loomed. Custer's obsession with speed and surprise meant he often underestimated the enemy's capacity to adapt. While the Union celebrated his raids, some officers warned that one misstep could undo months of careful planning. And in a way, the seeds of future disaster were already being sown. By the winter of 1864, Custer had become a living legend. His campaigns after Gettysburg, though overshadowed in history books by larger battles, had a profound and lasting impact on the Civil War. They showcased not only his tactical brilliance, but also the power of courage, intuition, and unrelenting audacity to shape history. Yet, as history would later reveal, brilliance can be a double-edged sword. The very traits that made Custer extraordinary would one day lead him to decisions with consequences far beyond the battlefield. Decisions that would etch his name permanently into American legend for both triumph and tragedy. By early 1865, the Civil War was nearing its end, but for Custer, the battles were far from over. His winter campaigns had left an indelible mark. Confederate forces were exhausted. Union morale was soaring, and Custer's reputation as a fearless, unconventional general had spread across both sides of the conflict. Yet the very traits that brought him fame, recklessness, intuition, and relentless pursuit of the enemy, now began to show cracks. Custer's officers noted that while his raids were brilliantly executed, they often placed men in extreme danger. One winter night, A miscalculated crossing of the Rappahannock River nearly cost the lives of dozens of his men when icy currents and miscommunication caused several units to become stranded. Custer personally waded through freezing water to rescue his soldiers, an act of heroism that only added to his almost mythical aura. In parallel, Custer's strategic influence reached beyond individual battles. Military historians today argue that his raids forced the Confederacy to divert troops and supplies that could have altered major engagements elsewhere. By cutting supply lines, capturing key outposts, and creating constant uncertainty, Custer indirectly contributed to victories that helped hasten the Union's ultimate triumph. But even as victory approached, Custer's personal ambition remained unchecked. He continued to take risks that others considered unnecessary, driven by a combination of ego, intuition, and an unyielding desire to leave a mark on history. Letters from fellow generals reveal a mix of admiration and concern. He wins when others would hesitate, yet I fear one day his luck may run out. History would prove this warning prescient. While Custer's Civil War campaigns secured his place as a military prodigy, they also set the stage for the choices that would later define his legacy. The same courage and audacity that saved countless lives and reshaped key campaigns would eventually lead him into one of the most infamous battles in American history, Little Bighorn. A confrontation where brilliance, risk, and fate collided with devastating consequences. And yet, it is these very campaigns, often overlooked in textbooks, that reveal the full scope of Custer's genius. Here was a man who, in the freezing mud and snow of the Shenandoah Valley, turned audacity into strategy, intuition into action, and a small cavalry force into a decisive instrument of war. In the grand sweep of history, Custer's winter and spring campaigns of 1863-64 remind us of a simple truth. Sometimes a single individual, acting with courage and insight, can change the course of events in ways far beyond what anyone could imagine.
After the winter and spring campaigns, Custer's star had never been brighter. He was no longer just a cavalry commander. He was a symbol of youthful daring, strategic brilliance, and relentless action. His name circulated in newspapers across the Union states, inspiring young soldiers and striking fear into Confederate forces. Yet, beneath the accolades, the seeds of future challenges were quietly growing. Custer's Civil War experience had honed more than just tactical skill. It had shaped his personality, instincts, and leadership style, traits that would follow him beyond the war. He had learned how to read the battlefield as a living organism, how to anticipate enemy moves with uncanny accuracy, and how to inspire loyalty that went beyond orders. These lessons, though forged in the chaos of the Civil War, would later influence his campaigns in the American West. By mid-1865, as the war drew to a close,
With the surrender of General Lee at Appomattox, Custer faced a moment of reckoning. He could have settled into a safe, prestigious role, leveraging his fame for a comfortable career in the army or politics. But his restless ambition, coupled with the thrill of command, pushed him toward new frontiers. He sought battles not just for glory, but to test his limits, to act on the instincts that had brought him such extraordinary success. Those who knew him well understood this duality. On one hand, he was courageous to a fault, willing to ride into impossible odds for the sake of strategy and honor. On the other, his fearlessness often skirted recklessness, a trait that would define both his triumphs and tragedies. Soldiers remembered nights spent under freezing stars, listening to Custer outline impossible maneuvers with the calm confidence of a man who had never known fear and perhaps never understood it. The Civil War had made Custer a hero in the eyes of many, but it had also conditioned him for the very risks that would later define his legacy in the West. The same intuition, the same audacity, and the same disregard for conventional caution would guide him in campaigns against Native American tribes, campaigns that would ultimately cement his name in history, for better and for worse. And so, as the Union celebrated its hard-won victory, Custer stood at a crossroads. He had conquered not just enemy forces, but also the boundaries of his own potential. The world was opening before him, filled with challenges that would test everything he had learned and demand the full measure of both his genius and his courage.
With the Civil War behind him, Custer's fame opened doors to new arenas of conflict. But the lessons he learned in the freezing Shenandoah Valley and during daring raids would define every step forward. He now turned his attention to the western frontier, a land of vast plains, untamed rivers, and a conflict entirely different from anything he had faced in the Civil War. Custer's cavalry experience proved invaluable. The same tactics he had perfected, rapid strikes, mobility, surprise maneuvers, and psychological warfare, were now applied against Native American tribes defending their homelands. He understood the importance of intelligence and terrain, often traveling ahead of his units to scout enemy positions, just as he had during his winter campaigns. His soldiers noted that he treated maps not as static tools, but as living guides, reading the landscape almost intuitively. But the frontier also tested him in new ways. Unlike conventional armies, the Native American forces were mobile, unpredictable, and intimately familiar with the terrain. They did not respond to traditional military pressure. Custer had to adapt his Civil War lessons. Feints became larger, strikes had to be faster, and the stakes were often personal. In 1866, during the Black Hills campaigns, Custer's reputation as a brilliant yet daring commander followed him. Reports from scouts described how he could seemingly predict the movement of enemy forces, striking supply lines or camps with precise timing. His Civil War experience, particularly his winter raids, which relied on speed, surprise, and intuition, had prepared him for this exact kind of warfare. He had learned to turn small, agile forces into strategic instruments, a principle that would define his most famous and controversial battles. Yet, just as in the Civil War, admiration came hand in hand with concern. Fellow officers noted that Custer's audacity often bordered on recklessness, and while it won victories, it also put his men at extreme risk. The same traits that had made him a legend in Pennsylvania and Virginia now made him both a formidable leader and a lightning rod for criticism in the West. What history often overlooks is that Custer's genius lay not just in courage, but in adaptability. He translated the lessons of the Civil War cavalry warfare to an entirely different context, proving that intuition, timing, and boldness could overcome even unfamiliar adversaries. Yet the frontier also foreshadowed a recurring theme in his life. Triumph and peril were inseparable. Each success carried the seeds of risk. Each brilliant maneuver could become a tragic miscalculation. By the end of this phase, Custer had become a figure larger than life, a hero of the Civil War, a rising star on the frontier, and a man walking the fine line between audacity and danger. His story, filled with triumph, insight, and looming risk, was far from over.
By 1876, George Armstrong Custer had become more than just a Civil War hero. He was a symbol of boldness, ambition, and unrelenting action. His Civil War campaigns had taught him to move fast, strike decisively, and trust his instincts. On the plains of the American West, these lessons were about to meet their ultimate test. Custer was now leading the 7th Cavalry Regiment into territories that were fiercely defended by the Lakota Sioux, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho tribes. Unlike conventional armies, these forces relied on mobility, intimate knowledge of the land, and sophisticated strategies honed over generations. Custer's cavalry, despite being well-trained and heavily armed, faced an enemy that could vanish and reappear at will. Here's the astonishing, often overlooked fact. Custer's prior experience in the Civil War had prepared him for many aspects of this conflict. His ability to read terrain, anticipate enemy movement, and execute daring flanking maneuvers were directly drawn from the raids he led after Gettysburg. Yet the stakes were far higher. Here, misjudgments would not just cost equipment or territory, but lives on an unprecedented scale. In June 1876, Custer's scouts discovered a large Native American encampment along the Little Bighorn River. Confident in his assessment, and driven by the same audacity that had brought him victories in Virginia and Pennsylvania, Custer decided on a bold assault. He divided his regiment into multiple detachments to encircle the village, a strategy reminiscent of his Civil War flanking operations. But here, history's cruel irony unfolded. The Native American forces were far larger and more coordinated than he had anticipated. The precision and audacity that had defined his Civil War campaigns now collided with an adversary who was equally cunning, highly mobile, and determined. What followed was one of the most famous and tragic encounters in American history. Custer's tactics, brilliant in principle, could not overcome the sheer scale and coordination of his enemy. In a matter of hours, Custer and his detachment were overwhelmed. Yet even in this disaster, echoes of his genius remained. He fought with the same courage, led his men with the same daring, and faced impossible odds with the same unyielding spirit that had defined his Civil War exploits. The Battle of Little Bighorn would immortalize him, not just as a figure of tragedy, but as a man whose audacity and brilliance had changed history, for better or worse. Custer's life, therefore, presents a paradox: a brilliant mind shaped by war, capable of extraordinary feats, yet walking a line where victory and catastrophe are inseparable. His Civil War campaigns, often forgotten, were the crucible that forged the courage, intuition, and audacity that would define his final legendary moments.
The story of George Armstrong Custer is, at its core, a tale of extraordinary courage, brilliant intuition, and the razor-thin line between triumph and disaster. From the frozen fields of Pennsylvania during the Civil War to the vast, untamed plains of the American West, Custer's life was defined by audacity. His winter and spring campaigns after Gettysburg, a chapter often overshadowed in history, reveal a man whose tactical genius reshaped battles with small cavalry units, whose instinctive grasp of terrain and timing allowed him to outmaneuver larger forces, and whose personal courage inspired loyalty and admiration among soldiers. These campaigns forged the skills, instincts, and reputation that would follow him throughout his life. Yet Custer's brilliance was inseparable from risk. His reliance on intuition, his fearless pursuit of audacious strategies, and his sometimes reckless disregard for conventional caution were double-edged. They delivered stunning victories in Virginia and Pennsylvania, but they also set the stage for the tragic culmination at Little Bighorn. Here, the same qualities that had made him a hero, courage, speed, tactical daring, collided with overwhelming forces, resulting in one of the most famous defeats in American military history. What makes Custer's story compelling for modern audiences in the USA is not just his battlefield exploits, but the human drama behind them. A young man propelled by ambition, intuition, and a relentless drive to act, whose decisions influenced the course of history in ways both visible and subtle. His life reminds us that history is often shaped by individuals willing to take risks that others fear, yet that genius and recklessness can coexist in ways that are both inspiring and tragic. In the end, Custer's legacy is neither simple heroism nor simple failure. It is the story of a man whose audacity, skill and intuition left an indelible mark on American history. A man who became larger than life, for better and for worse, through both his Civil War campaigns and his fateful final stand. History remembers him not only for his victories and defeats, but for the courage and daring that defined every step of his extraordinary journey.
For more historical reality stories like this, subscribe to our channel and like, comment, and share with your friends.